The plant dumped wet grain against his fence for 10 years until they found out what he did. On the morning of that Tuesday, the truck arrived just as it always did, without warning, without asking permission, with the indifference of someone who knows they won't meet any resistance. The dump bed rose slowly, and the wet, fermented corn, with that sour, heavy smell that stuck in your throat and lingered in the air for hours afterward, began to fall against the old wooden fence with a dull, steady thud, mixing with the grey mud at the edge of the dirt road. On the other side of the fence, a man stood still, his fists clenched on the wooden rail, his eyes fixed on the load descending unhurriedly. And there was something in that expression on that morning that was different from all the mornings before. Exactly 10 years had passed since this ritual began. Week after week, sometimes twice a week during the busiest production periods at the Prairie Grain Processing Corp., which had set up on the land next to his property a little over 12 years ago. 10 years of the smell of fermentation saturating the air. 10 years of rotten grain soaking the soil along the boundary and slowly destroying everything that strip of land still tried to produce. 10 years of ignored complaints, of doors closing, of answers that never came. The plant workers no longer even looked at the man on the other side of the fence. They were so used to that quiet, still figure that they had simply stopped really seeing him. And that was precisely what made them misjudge so badly. One of the workers, a young man named Caleb Miller, who had been on that job for just over 3 months, was the only one who looked at that man long enough to notice that something was different that morning. Caleb was 26 years old and had grown up in a family of farmers in a small town in rural Nebraska nearly 2 hours away. He knew the land. He could tell the smell of a good crop from the smell of a ruined one. And there was something in the expression of the man at the fence that bothered him in a way he couldn't name. It wasn't anger he saw on that face. It was a strange calm, almost serene, that didn't match what was happening right in front of him. Caleb pulled down the brim of his cap and went back to work. There were more loads to unload before lunch, and the manager was pushing the deadline. The truck closed its dump bed, backed up with a deep engine rumble, and drove off down the dirt road leading to the plant yard. The other workers climbed into the bed of a pickup truck and left as well. Within a few minutes, no one was left but the man and the pile of wet grain, which was lightly steaming in the cold morning, mixed with mud and smelling of old fermentation. The man stood there for a few more minutes. His eyes swept over the scattered grain, the ruined ground, the fence that had been rebuilt 3 times in the last 10 years because the rotting corn ran through the woodwork and sped up the decay of the lumber. Then, unhurriedly, he let go of the rail, turned his back on all of it, and walked back toward the shed about 50 yards onto the property. He didn't look back. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The man's name was Arthur Jenkins, 73 years old, hair completely white, which the morning wind gently moved to one side, and his face weathered by more than 5 decades of open sun and pre-dawn cold. He wasn't tall, but he had broad shoulders and thick hands, the hands of someone who had worked the land since he was 14, when he started helping his father after his older brother left for the city and never came back. He moved with the quiet steadiness of someone who knows every inch of the ground he walks on, and there was a certain silent authority in the way he carried himself across the property, something people noticed without being able to fully explain. That land had been his for over 40 years, passed down from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather, who arrived in that part of rural Nebraska when there wasn't even a paved road nearby, just an ox cart track and thick woods. The farm wasn't large, but it was tended with a care that bordered on religious, every fence mended at the right time, every furrow opened at the exact moment for planting. There was an old but sturdy shed, a brick house with a wooden porch painted blue, an artesian well that had never run dry even in the worst droughts, and a vegetable garden out back that Mr. Arthur kept more out of habit than financial need, because growing something in the soil was as natural to him as breathing. He was a man of few words and a long memory, the kind who forgets nothing, not out of resentment, but because he believes that facts have a value that doesn't expire with time. Mr. Arthur's father had told him once, back when the two of them were working together in the fields at the end of a harvest afternoon, that land isn't just dirt. That land is what a whole family has left inside it over generations, the sweat, the effort, the hope, and that when someone tries to take that away from you, they're taking away more than property. They're trying to take away memory. Mr. Arthur was 12 years old that day and hadn't said a word in reply because a child doesn't answer when an adult says something important. But he stored it away. He stored it the way he stored everything that mattered, carefully, in silence, waiting for the moment when it would all make sense. 61 years later, it made all the sense in the world. Prairie Grain Processing Corp. had set up on the neighboring property a little over 12 years ago. Mr. Arthur still remembered clearly the day the machinery arrived, the noise of the earth moving that woke up the whole region in the first weeks of construction. Back then, the plant's owner, a man named Lawrence Sterling, called a meeting at the parish hall of the nearest township. He arrived in an imported car, wearing a neatly pressed grey suit and a wide smile that took up his entire face. He talked about jobs for the farmers' children, about developing the area, about the respect the company would have for its rural neighbors, about a permanent communication channel that would always be open for anyone with questions or concerns. He shook hands, he handed out business cards. He had his picture taken with the older folks in the community. Mr. Arthur was in that room, sitting in one of the plastic chairs in the back. He heard every word, and he was suspicious from the very first moment. Not out of ill will, but out of experience. He was 71 years old then, and had seen enough to recognize the difference between a promise made to be kept and a promise made to calm people down. But he stayed quiet. The plant hadn't done anything wrong yet. It was just a new plant. The first dumpings started 2 years after the opening. At first they were occasional. A load here, another there, always on weekends when there were fewer people around. Mr. Arthur noticed it right away the first time. He walked to the edge of the fence and stood staring at that pile of damp corn, like someone looking at something they recognized but never expected to find in that place. The smell was distinct, sour and heavy. The smell of grain that had fermented inside a damp warehouse and that nobody wanted before dumping it. And the dumping spot wasn't random. It was exactly on the strip where Mr. Arthur's fence was closest to the plant's facilities, in an area he used for planting squash and okra at the start of the warm season. The following Monday, he went in person to the plant's headquarters and asked to speak with the person in charge. He waited over an hour in the reception area, sitting in a leather chair that had clearly been placed there to impress visitors of greater importance than himself. When the man appeared, he said his name was Gregory Blackwood, that he was the general manager, and he stood the whole time with his arms crossed, without inviting Mr. Arthur to sit down. Mr. Arthur explained what had happened, calmly and in detail. Gregory listened with an expression caught between boredom and condescension. When the farmer finished, the manager replied that the grain was organic waste, that the relevant legislation allowed the disposal of that type of residue in bordering areas, and that the farmer should get used to it because the Prairie Grain Processing Corp. Was there to stay, and operations weren't going to change because of an informal complaint. "You can check with any specialist," Gregory said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything within what the law allows." Mr. Arthur looked at him for a long moment, with the same calmness he had spoken with the same calmness he had entered that room. "All right," he said, and he left. The following Monday, he bought a new notebook at the township's stationery store. On the notebook's cover, in firm, clear handwriting, he wrote the start date and the simple title he had given to that project, which still had no definitive name in his head: Boundary Record, Jenkins Farm. Inside on the first page was the date of the first dumping, the approximate time, the description of the truck, the estimated volume of dumped grain, and the condition of the soil shortly after. There was also a photo taped in, taken with the simple camera his daughter had given him the previous birthday so he could photograph the garden during the changing seasons. At that moment, no one knew what that notebook represented. Not even Mr. Arthur himself was entirely sure of what he was building. He only knew that if he was going to have to fight for that land, he would rather fight with proof. And that proof doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's built, record by record. With the patience of someone who understands that some harvests take many years to come, Audrey Jenkins was 48 years old, lived in the city 40 minutes from her father's property, and had visited him every Saturday without fail for over a decade, ever since her mother had passed away after a long illness that had lasted 2 years and had left the family home with a silence that Mr. Arthur had never tried to fill. Audrey worked as an administrative assistant at a transport company, had been divorced for 8 years after a marriage that had started with hope and ended with exhaustion, and was raising alone a 16-year-old son named Samuel, who sometimes accompanied her on visits to his grandfather and spent afternoons fishing in the irrigation pond at the back of the property, which was the place he loved most in the world, even though he never said it out loud. Audrey loved her father with that specific mix of admiration and worry that children carry for stubborn and proud parents. She saw the strength in him, but she also saw the fatigue that accumulated on his shoulders over the years, the weight that the problems with the factory added week after week. She had long come to the conclusion that that man would not admit he was getting old as long as there was a reason to get up in the morning. In the first years of the dumpings, she had tried to help in the ways she knew. She suggested that her father see a lawyer. Mr. Arthur said a lawyer without proof is a letter without an address. She proposed they go together to the Regional Farmers Cooperative. He said the cooperative had plenty of goodwill and little practical action. She insisted that they should at least file a formal complaint somewhere. He said a complaint without solid documentation was more trouble than it was worth. Over the years, Audrey learned that her father had a way of dealing with things that was neither slowness nor cowardice. It was method. He believed that everything had its right time, and that rushing a conclusion before it was ready meant wasting everything that had been built up until that point. What Audrey didn't know, however, was the extent of what her father was doing during those hours he spent alone in the shed. One winter Saturday, 3 years after the dumping began, she had arrived earlier than usual and found her father at the kitchen table with an open notebook and the camera in his hand, transferring images from a memory card with the concentration of someone doing something important. When he noticed his daughter had come in, he closed the notebook with an almost imperceptible naturalness. "Just organizing some photos of the garden," he said. Audrey looked at the notebook, at the camera, at her father's face. "Dad, are you okay?" "I am, yes," he replied, and got up to put the kettle on the stove, ending the subject with the same gesture he used to end topics he didn't want to delve into. She didn't ask any more, but she didn't forget. During that same period, Arthur had expanded his documentation system in ways that went beyond what he had originally planned. He had learned, by observing over the seasons, that the moisture content of the grain varied depending on the time of year, and that the impact on the soil was considerably greater when the dumping happened right after a period of rain. He also began recording the weather conditions of each day of the dump, noting down information from the radio's weather report. He started measuring, with a tape measure he took to the boundary line, the distance the grain spread onto his property with each dump. Over the years, he calculated that the contamination zone had advanced from 1.5 meters to almost 4 meters into his land. There was also a map, drawn by hand on graph paper, with measurements noted in pencil and markings in red, showing the progression of the affected area year after year. It wasn't an engineer's map, but it had a precision that would impress anyone who saw it, because it was made by someone who knew that land better than any instrument ever could. The camera he had given to Audrey the first time broke in the 4th year. When she asked if her father wanted another one, he said yes, simply, without explaining why. She bought a digital camera, a slightly better one, on the Christmas sale. From then on, Arthur started photographing more frequently and more carefully, always from the exact same position, so that comparing one image to another over the years would clearly reveal the progression of the damage. In the shed, behind a thick tarp, he hung over a wooden shelf he had built especially for that purpose. There were 12 notebooks lined up by year. Beside them, in cardboard boxes sealed with tape and labeled with dates, were the film rolls from the first years and the memory cards from the more recent ones, each kept inside a plastic bag with the date written in permanent marker. And at the back of the shelf, in a blue folder newer than everything else, were copies of letters he had sent over the last 2 years, with no return address, but with carefully chosen addressees. In the 6th year of the dumping, something happened that Arthur had both feared and hoped for. It was on an October morning, right after a drought that had lasted longer than normal that year. He went to the boundary line, intending to check how the soil had been during the dry months, with the dumping that had continued even without rain. He knelt down on the ground and picked up a handful with his hands. The soil that had always been dense and dark, that Nebraska soil his family had cultivated for generations, was dry, crumbly, with a grayish color that wasn't natural. When he tried to squeeze the handful, it crumbled into dust. Arthur Jenkins knelt on that ground for a long time, not because he was tired, but because he needed to understand what he was holding in his hands. That wasn't just dead soil. It was an entire section of his property that had been destroyed progressively, methodically, as if someone was erasing the land with the patience of someone who knows it'll take a while but will get there. He opened his fist, let the dust fall, and watched it disappear into the dry October wind. Then he got up, walked back to the shed, took the ledger off the shelf, and made the longest entry he had ever made. Not just the date and volume of the most recent discharge, but a detailed description of the soil condition, comparing it with notes from previous years, with measurements of the affected area, and with a conclusion he wrote in his own hand with his usual steady script. The land in this strip isn't just compromised, it's dead. Recovery will require technical intervention and will cost dollars I don't have, but the responsibility isn't mine. When Audrey arrived that Saturday, he was on the porch, quiet, his hands still smudged with dry soil not yet fully washed off. She sat down beside him and stayed silent for a while, waiting, because she had learned over the years that her father's silence sometimes needed space before any words. "I lost the boundary strip," he said finally. "The land died." Audrey looked at him. "How much land?" "The whole strip, about 20 feet long by nearly 13 feet wide." She did the math in her head. She knew what that meant for a garden the size of her father's. "And what are you going to do?" she asked carefully. "What I always do," he said. "Record it. Keep it. Wait." She was quiet for a moment. "Dad, I know you have a method, but I worry about you. This has been going on for 6 years. You're not going to fight this battle for another 6 years alone." "I won't be alone," he said. "What do you mean?" "I mean the right moment will come, and when it comes, I won't be alone." Audrey looked at her father for a long time. There was something in the way he said it that was different from other times. It wasn't just stubbornness. It was a specific certainty, the kind people have when they've already made a decision and are just waiting for the conditions to carry it out. She didn't ask anything else, but she took longer than usual to leave that Saturday. On the other side of the fence, during that same period, the situation had developed in ways Mr. Arthur didn't know in detail, but suspected. Gregory Blackwood was 52 years old, with dark hair graying at the temples, and the kind of posture built over years of convincing himself he was more important than everyone around him. He wore neatly pressed shirts, even on days he visited the fields, spoke on the phone in a voice habitually louder than necessary, and had developed over the years a calm, almost professional contempt for everything he classified as a small-scale farmer's obstacle. The farmer on the other side of the fence was, in the internal reports Gregory sent to the company owner, referred to as the neighbor on the north boundary, never by name. It was a problem to be solved, not a person, and the plan to solve it had been drawn up 2 years after the first discharges, when it became clear the old man wasn't going to sell voluntarily. Prairie Grain Processing Corp. Needed to expand. The storage shed had reached its capacity limit, and production demand required more space. The neighbor's land, which bordered the shed on the north side, was the only viable expansion option without prohibitive acquisition costs, but the man wouldn't sell. And when Gregory had made the first offer, discreet and informal in a hallway of a rural association meeting, the old man had simply said he wasn't interested and turned his back. The strategy of the dumpings hadn't started as a deliberate strategy. In the early days, it was really just operational carelessness, a truck dumping waste wherever it was most convenient, without anyone asking exactly where. But when Gregory realized the old man complained and nothing happened, he also saw an opportunity. With the systematic dumpings on the boundary line, the neighbor's land would lose value over time. A year, 2 years, maybe 3. The soil degraded, the crops compromised, the old man alone with no way to prove anything. At the right time, the offer would come at a price that suited the company. On paper, it was a simple plan. In practice, it was the biggest mistake Gregory had ever made in his life. What made the dumpings even more serious, from the perspective of Gregory's plan, was that the internal orders had become progressively more specific over the years. In the early days, the trucks dumped the waste on the boundary line out of convenience, but from the 5th year onward, there were verbal instructions passed down by shift supervisors to carry out the dumpings in a way that maximized infiltration into the neighboring property. Taking advantage of rainy days, positioning the dump truck so that the angle of the discharge sent more material onto Mr. Arthur's land. It was such a normalized practice that the line workers no longer saw it as anything out of the ordinary. Caleb Miller had noticed. He had arrived at the Prairie Grain Processing Corp. 3 months before that Tuesday, hired as a yard assistant, and since his 2nd week on the job, he had felt uncomfortable with what he saw on the north boundary. He had grown up on a farm in rural Nebraska. He knew what land was. He knew what that kind of dumping did to the soil over time. And there was in the way the supervisors gave instructions about positioning the dump truck on the north boundary, something that didn't sound like normal operations. One afternoon in the 3rd week, he had quietly mentioned to the co-worker next to him that it didn't seem right, that the position of the dump truck seemed deliberate for reaching the neighbor's side. The co-worker had shaken his head and told him not to stick his nose where it wasn't wanted. 2 days later, Caleb had been transferred to the equipment maintenance sector, far from the boundary, without anyone explaining the reason for the change. But what he had seen and heard stayed with him. And what he had seen in that man at the fence that Tuesday morning stayed even more. Mr. Arthur's nearest neighbor, on the other side of the property, was a man named Thomas West. 62 years old, still strong, but with knees that complained with changes in the weather, thin hair and a grey mustache that had been brown for a long time. Thomas had been a widower for 6 years and lived alone on the neighboring property, which was a bit larger than Mr. Arthur's, but less well-maintained, with certain areas that had been gradually abandoned as it became harder to take care of everything without help. The two had been neighbors for over 30 years and shared the friendship of those who lived the same kind of life without needing to explain it. Once a week, early in the morning, they would meet at the gate that separated the 2 properties and have coffee with bread and cheese that Thomas usually brought, sitting on the canvas chairs that Mr. Arthur had installed there years ago. Thomas had also suffered impacts from the factory, though in a different way. A drainage ditch that ran along the back of his land had started receiving waste from the factory that came down from the watercourse upstream. During peak production times, the ditch smelled bad and the cattle refused to drink from it. Thomas had once filed a complaint at the Prairie Grain Processing Corp headquarters and received a response similar to what Arthur had gotten. But Thomas didn't have Arthur's quiet resilience. He was a man more prone to discouragement, more likely to conclude that some battles weren't worth fighting. "I'll tell you something, Arthur," he said one morning over coffee, staring at the horizon with both elbows on his knees. "If those people made me a good offer for the place today, I'd think about it." Arthur looked at him without haste. "You've been planting on this land for the last 30 years, he said. "Yeah, and I won't have the next 30, Thomas replied with a tired, lopsided grin. "Wait a little longer," Arthur said. "Don't sell just yet." Thomas looked at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Is something going on that I don't know about?" "Not yet," Arthur said. "But it will." Thomas didn't ask what it was. He knew his neighbor well enough to understand that when Arthur spoke in that tone, it was because he'd thought long and hard before saying a word. 2 days after that conversation, Arthur went to the nearby township post office with a large envelope made of reinforced cardboard. Inside were selected photocopies from 3 notebooks, a set of printed photos in chronological order spanning 6 years of records, and a single-page handwritten letter with no return address, addressed to the Regional Farmers Cooperative, care of a woman named Martha Reed. It was Audrey who had mentioned Mrs. Martha's name a year earlier, without realizing she was planting a seed. She'd read in the township newspaper about a lawsuit the cooperative had filed against a fertilizer company that had contaminated a spring area, and had mentioned it over coffee to her father that there were people who still got results through such channels. Arthur hadn't said anything, but he had tucked the name away. Martha Reed was 71 years old and had spent 40 of those years championing some kind of collective cause. First the school mothers group, then the community council, then the rural women's cooperative, and in the last 12 years she had taken over and held the presidency of the regional farmers cooperative with a combination of energy, clarity, and stubbornness that no one in the region had managed to surpass in any election. She was a small woman with short white hair, always wearing a blue smock and carrying a folder tucked under her arm where she kept her minutes, agendas, and any documents she thought might come in handy. She had a steady voice accustomed to being heard, eyes that sized people up with the speed of someone who's seen plenty, and a memory that people at the cooperative often compared to an old metal filing cabinet. It never loses anything and is never out of order. Mrs. Martha had had her own run-ins with Lawrence Sterling's plant over the years. 3 years after it opened, she had tried to launch an investigation into the waste reaching the waterway that supplied part of the region. She had gathered testimonies, attended meetings, pushed hard, and she had hit a wall. Without solid technical documentation, soil analysis, or concrete and measurable evidence, everything turned into one side's claims against the others, and the plant had more capacity to sustain the fight than the rural producers. She had backed down, but she hadn't forgotten. When the envelope with no return address arrived at the cooperative headquarters that Tuesday morning, Mrs. Martha was in the meeting room with 2 directors discussing the agenda for the upcoming assembly. The secretary walked in, placed the envelope on the table, and said there was no sender. Mrs. Martha looked at the envelope. The address was handwritten in the careful script of someone who learned to write in a time when penmanship was taught with precision. She excused herself to the directors, opened it right there, and began to read. For a few minutes, the room was silent. The 2 directors exchanged a glance when they saw Martha's expression change as she flipped through the pages. It wasn't surprise on her face. It was the recognition of someone finally seeing something they had been waiting for a long time. "Who left this here?" she asked the secretary. "It came by mail, Mrs. Martha, yesterday afternoon." She looked at the photos, at the dates, at the meticulous notes of someone who had spent 10 years documenting, alone, what no one else had managed to record with that precision. She closed the envelope carefully, tucked it under her arm along with the blue folder, and told the directors the meeting would have to wait. She went to the Jenkins farm 3 days later. Arthur saw her coming down the dirt road, recognized the small figure in the blue jacket, and went to the gate to wait for her. They greeted each other with the formality of people who respect each other but aren't close. She walked in without further ceremony, refused the coffee he offered, and sat on the porch chair with the folder on her lap. "I received the envelope," she said directly. Arthur nodded. "Why didn't you identify yourself?" she asked. "Because I wanted you to judge it by what was inside, not by who sent it," he replied. Mrs. Martha looked at him for a moment with an expression that was almost approval. "Is there more?" she asked. "There are 10 more years of records in there," he said, nodding toward the shed. "What I sent was just a sample." She took a deep breath. "I need someone who can do a technical soil analysis, a real expert assessment that gives legal weight to what's documented in the notebooks. Would you let a technician come in to collect samples?" "You can send him," said Arthur. "I'm waiting." Mrs. Martha stood up, adjusted the folder under her arm, and walked to the gate. Before leaving, she turned to him and said something she hadn't planned to say. "I tried to stop that plant 3 years after it opened. You know that." "I know," said Arthur. "I saw you at that meeting back then." She stood there for a moment looking at him. "I couldn't because I didn't have what you have," she said. "You kept it well." "I kept it," he said simply. She left down the dirt road with the same steady step she had arrived with. Arthur stayed at the gate for a moment after her car disappeared around the curve. Then he went back to the shed, walked over to the shelf covered by the tarp, stood looking at the 12 notebooks and the 12 labeled boxes, and he felt for the first time in many years something that felt very much like relief. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, the technician Mrs. Martha hired was named Grant Sullivan, 45 years old, an agronomist by training with 15 years of experience in soil analysis and environmental assessment in cases of rural damage. He was a discreet man, with glasses and a notebook in hand, who spoke little and observed a lot, and who had arrived at Arthur's property on a Wednesday morning with a box of collection equipment and a professional camera. Arthur received him at the gate and took him straight to the boundary line. Grant stood for a few minutes looking at the ground before opening any equipment. Then he went to the wooden fence, knelt down, grabbed a handful of soil in his hand, squeezed it, felt the texture, smelled it. He stared at what was in the palm of his hand with the expression of someone confirming something they already suspected. "How long has it been like this?" asked Grant. "The soil here started to change 6 years ago," said Arthur. "I've had everything recorded from before." Grant looked at him. 10 years of records," said Arthur. "Photos, notebooks, notes by date." There was a silence. 10 years, Grant repeated, more quietly, as if processing it. 10 years, Arthur confirmed. The technician spent the entire morning on the property. He collected samples at 9 different points, starting at the edge of the fence and moving inward every 50 centimeters until he reached the spot where the soil returned to its natural color. He photographed, measured, and took notes. Arthur accompanied him the whole time in silence, only answering when asked. At the end of the morning, as Grant was organizing the sample containers, Arthur asked, "What can you tell me already?" Grant was silent for a moment. "That the contamination from fungi and decomposing organisms in that strip of land is extensive," he finally said, "and that it didn't come from a single accident. For it to be like this, it took systematic repetition over years." He paused. "The full report will take about 12 days. But what I'm seeing here preliminarily is documentable and measurable." Arthur nodded, showing no emotion. "Do you need to go into the barn?" he asked. "To see the records?" "Yes. If it's everything you say, it'll make a big difference in the report." Arthur opened the barn, led the technician to the shelf, and pulled off the tarp. Grant stared at the 12 notebooks, the 12 labeled boxes, and the blue folder with the copies. He stood there for a time that seemed too long for a simple reaction. Then he took off his glasses, cleaned the lens with the hem of his shirt, put them back on, and looked at that shelf again like someone looking at something they didn't expect to find. "You did this alone?" he asked. "I did," said Arthur. Grant was silent for another moment. "Can I take the originals, or would you rather I work with copies?" he asked finally, his voice more careful, like someone handling something he recognized as valuable. "I'd rather you work with copies," said Arthur. "The originals stay here." "With all due respect, that's the right decision," said Grant. The report arrived in 13 days, and Mrs. Martha read it that same afternoon, sitting at the conference table at the Regional Farmers Cooperative with 2 board members beside her. The document was 42 pages long and concluded without ambiguity that the strip of land on the northern border of the Jenkins farm had undergone a process of severe and progressive degradation over at least 8 years, caused by repeated exposure to organic matter in an advanced state of decomposition, resulting in the destruction of practically all of the fertile topsoil in an area of approximately 600 square meters. The report also stated that recovery was possible, but would require a long and costly remediation process, and that the responsibility for the damage was directly attributable to the identified source of deposition. Mrs. Martha closed the report, placed her fingertips together on the table, and stared out the window for a few seconds. "We need to gather the farmers," she said. The meeting happened the following Saturday on the porch of Arthur's farm. It wasn't announced as a formal assembly. Mrs. Martha personally called 10 farmers in the region, briefly explained there was news about the Prairie Grain Processing Corp., and asked if they could come on a Saturday afternoon. 15 showed up. They came with their wives, some with grown children, all with that mix of curiosity and skepticism of people who had been to too many meetings on the same subject without results. Arthur welcomed them on the porch, set out wooden benches borrowed from their neighbor, Thomas, and Mrs. Martha stood at the entrance of the barn to speak. She showed the report. She explained what Arthur had documented. She told them about the photos, the notebooks, the system that man had set up alone for 10 years, telling almost no one. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough for every person there to process what they had heard. Audrey, who was there that Saturday with no idea what was about to happen, looked at her father sitting in a wooden chair at the corner of the porch and felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't just pride, though that was part of it too. It was the kind of understanding that comes late and all at once when you suddenly realize what those hours in the shed meant, what those years of silence had held inside. "Dad," she said softly, leaning in close to him. He looked at her. "When were you going to tell me?" "When the time came," he said. "And now is the time?" "Now it is." She swallowed hard. Her eyes stung, but she didn't let anything fall. She knew her father well enough to know that crying there at that moment, in front of all those people, wasn't what he wanted. One of the older farmers present, a quiet man named Barney, who had stopped planting on an entire section of his land 3 years ago without fully understanding why, asked if he could have samples taken from his property too. Grant Sullivan, whom Mrs. Martha had invited to the meeting, said yes. Other farmers began reporting smaller issues, damage they had attributed to the weather or the season, without considering another cause. The plant had affected far more people than Arthur had documented on his own land, but in scattered smaller ways that alone didn't seem enough to lead anywhere. Together, they were something else. When the meeting ended and people started to leave, Thomas West was the last to go. He stood beside Arthur at the entrance to the farm, looking out at the empty dirt road in the approaching night. "When you told me to wait," said Thomas slowly, "I thought you were going to do something. But I had no idea it was this." "I didn't exactly know what it was going to be either," said Arthur. "I just knew it was going to be something." Thomas shook his head. "You're as stubborn as a tree root," he said, in a tone that was both complaint and tribute. "I learned it from my father," said Arthur. News that a meeting had taken place at the Jenkins farm reached the plant 3 days later through the usual channels for such news. Someone mentioned it to someone who knew an employee, and the employee mentioned it to the supervisor, who mentioned it to Gregory. Gregory didn't take it seriously at first. Farmer meetings were a constant in that area and rarely led anywhere concrete. But when he learned 2 days later that an agronomist had collected samples at the neighbor's property and that a technical report was circulating among the region's producers, his peace of mind evaporated. Gregory drove to Arthur's property that Wednesday afternoon in the company car with 2 employees. He knocked on the gate with the confidence of someone used to solving things with money. Arthur came to the gate slowly, with the steadiness of someone who has neither hurry nor urgency. He looked at Gregory, at the 2 employees behind him, at the company car. "What do you want?" he asked, without aggression but without courtesy. "I'd like to talk, Mr. Arthur," said Gregory, in a tone that tried to sound friendly, but had the stiffness of someone not used to asking. "The company is prepared to make an offer for the property, a serious offer, a real one." "I'm not selling. Hear me out before you answer. You could buy a house in town, live close to your daughter, live comfortably for the rest of your life without having to worry about this place. The amount the company is willing to offer is—" "I said I'm not selling," Arthur repeated, in the same calm tone. Gregory shifted his stance. He grew tenser. "I know you spoke with Martha Reed. I know there's a report making the rounds. But you need to understand that what happened at the boundary is within what the law allows, and that a technical report alone won't—" "That's enough," said Mr. Arthur, with the same 2 words as always. And he closed the gate. Gregory stood on the other side of the gate for a moment, with an expression he himself couldn't have described. Then he sent the workers back to the car and followed after them. On the way back to the Prairie Grain Processing Corp, he called the company owner. "Lawrence," he said when the call connected, We've got a bigger problem than I thought." On the other end of the line, Lawrence Sterling was silent for a long moment. How much bigger? Gregory looked out the window at the property that was receding in the rearview mirror. "Bigger than any offer we can make now," he said. What happened in the following days was the kind of thing Mr. Arthur didn't expect specifically, but which didn't surprise him either. One Monday morning, when he went to pick up the milk that Thomas usually left for him near the gate at the boundary between the two properties, he found a truck from the plant parked sideways at the start of the dirt road leading to the main entrance of his property. The truck had no driver. It was simply parked there, blocking the way. Mr. Arthur walked to the plant. He asked to speak with Gregory. Gregory wasn't available. The shift supervisor said the truck was waiting for authorization for a delivery and would be moved soon. Mr. Arthur went back home. The truck stayed parked for 4 hours. When it left, it stayed in place for another 40 minutes, just long enough to be inconvenient. On Tuesday, he noticed that the drainage ditch running along the south edge of his property had slightly shifted its course. Not much, but enough for water to start pooling in a low area of the land that used to drain normally. It was the kind of thing that could be explained as a construction accident. But Mr. Arthur knew that land like he knew his daughter's face. He knew when something had changed without a natural reason. He took photos. He made notes. He kept it all. When Audrey arrived on Saturday that week, she found her father on the porch with that expression of someone processing something important and preferring not to talk until he was done. She sat down beside him and waited. "What happened this week?" she asked. He told her the truck, the ditch, Gregory's visit, and the rejected offer. Audrey listened with her hands in her lap. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I want to go talk to this Gregory." "It's no use," said Mr. Arthur. "Dad, they're trying to intimidate you. That can't go unanswered." "It already has an answer," he said. "It's just not time to give it yet." Audrey looked at him with that mix of admiration and frustration that daughters of stubborn fathers know all too well. "You have a way of driving me crazy," she said. He almost smiled. "You got that from your mother," he replied. But the following Monday, Audrey went to the plant anyway. She went without telling her father. She took the day off work, got in the car, and went. She knew she wouldn't settle anything with the manager, but something pushed her there in a way she couldn't ignore. It was a mix of anger at the situation and love for her father, who had fought alone for 10 years and deserved at least someone to be visibly on his side. The receptionist made her wait 20 minutes before saying the manager could see her. Gregory's office was large for the size of the plant, with a window overlooking the operations yard. He was standing when she entered, with his usual posture, his arms slightly away from his body, like someone too busy to sit down. "Miss Audrey, right?" he said. "The neighbor's daughter." "The daughter of Valdemar Correa," she said, "and yes, have a seat. I'd rather stand, thank you." She crossed her arms. "I came to tell you that what's happening to my father's property isn't a coincidence. The truck at the entrance, the redirected ditch, and I want you to know that everything is being documented." Gregory looked at her with that expression he had already used on her father, the one of someone who listens but isn't really hearing. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Trucks sometimes need to stop for operational reasons. Drainage ditches are managed by the property that maintains them. If there are infrastructure issues on your father's land, that's his responsibility as the owner." "I understand," said Audrey. "So everything is documented on your end too?" Gregory raised an eyebrow slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean my father has 10 years of records on what happens at the border between his property and this processing plant. And if you also have everything documented, as you said, then let's compare the documentation." There was a brief but noticeable silence. Gregory recovered quickly, with the ease of someone used to not showing when they've been caught off guard. "I believe this matter should be handled through the proper channels," he said. "If there's anything to be formalized, our team is available." "Thank you," said Audrey. "That's exactly what will happen." She turned her back and headed for the exit. It was in the hallway that it happened. She was almost at the door when she felt a presence beside her, someone who had come out of a side room and was walking in the same direction. She glanced over and saw a young man, cap in hand, wearing work overalls, looking at her with an expression that wasn't exactly urgent, but was definitely intentional. He opened the door for her as if it were courtesy. But when she passed, he passed too, and in the outer hallway, where there were fewer people, he said in a low voice without looking directly at her, "Are you Mr. Arthur's daughter?" She looked at him. Early 20s, serious eyes. "I am," she said just as quietly. "My name is Caleb. I've worked here for 4 months." A short pause. "I have something that might help your father." He handed her an envelope folded in half, in a way that made it look like just any piece of paper being passed in the hallway. She took it without looking down. "I don't know if it'll be enough," he said. "But what's written in there is what I was told to do. In my own handwriting, signed." Audrey looked at him for a second. "Are you sure about what you're doing?" she said. "I am," said Caleb. "I know I could lose my job, but I grew up on a farm. I can't just stand by and watch that." She folded the envelope and put it inside her bag. Caleb went back inside without looking back. Audrey walked to the car with her heart beating harder than she expected. She only opened the envelope after she was sitting in the car with it closed. It was a sheet of paper folded 3 times, written by hand in the careful script of someone young but meticulous, who had clearly thought about every word before writing. At the top, the date, 3 weeks earlier. In the body of the text, Caleb described the orders he had received from the shift supervisor to unload the waste grain preferably at the plant's northern boundary, making sure the volume was deposited in a way that maximized seepage into the neighboring property. There was a specific instruction for rainy days, to use the runoff to expand the contamination area. At the bottom of the page, in the same careful handwriting, "I, Caleb Miller, declare that I received the above orders verbally and that I carried them out 3 times before being transferred to another department. I make this declaration of my own free will without pressure from anyone, and I am willing to confirm it in person if necessary." The date, the signature. Audrey sat still in the car for a few minutes, staring at that sheet. Then she put it back in the envelope, placed the envelope carefully inside her bag, and started the car. When she arrived at her father's property that afternoon, Arthur was in the shed. She walked in, went straight up to him, and set the envelope on the counter in front of him without saying a word. He looked at her, at the envelope. He opened it slowly, read it slowly, with that complete attention he gave to anything important. When he finished, he closed the paper, put it back in the envelope, and was silent. Audrey waited. "You went there alone?" he said at last. "I did." "He gave this to you willingly?" "Yes. He said he grew up on a farm." Mr. Arthur was silent for another moment. Then he closed his eyes. He stayed like that for maybe 10 seconds, with the expression of someone feeling the weight of something that had been carried for a long time and had just become a little lighter. When he opened his eyes, he looked at his daughter. "I need you to keep this safe," he said, "in a copy in 2 separate places." "I'll do it," she said. "And the young man. He needs to know he won't be left unprotected in what's about to happen." "I said I'd try to help." "It's not about trying," said Mr. Arthur. "You have to make sure." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Gregory found out 2 days later that Caleb had handed something over to the neighbor's daughter. He didn't know exactly what. One of the supervisors had spotted the scene in the hallway and mentioned it casually without realizing its importance. But Gregory knew Caleb. He knew the young man had asked uncomfortable questions about the evictions before being transferred. He knew he had grown up in a family of farmers, and when he put 2 and 2 together, a chill went down his spine, one he hadn't felt in a long time. He called Caleb to his office the next day. Caleb came. He walked in with his cap in his hand and stood on the other side of the desk without sitting down because Gregory didn't invite him. "Did you talk to Mr. Arthur's daughter?" Gregory asked straight out. "I did," Caleb said, with the calm of someone who had already made the decision that mattered and knew the rest was just consequence. "What did you give her?" Caleb was silent for a moment. Then he said, "A statement, in my own handwriting and with my signature, describing the orders I received about the evictions at the boundary line." The silence that followed lasted long enough to fill the entire room. "Do you know what you're doing?" Gregory finally said in a voice that had shifted to something Caleb recognized as the border between a veiled threat and an open one. "I do," Caleb said. "I'm doing what I should have done from the start." Gregory stood up. "You're fired as of today," he said. "That's fine," Caleb said. "But before you make that decision, you should know that I've already made a second statement, more detailed, with more dates and specific information, and that second statement is already stored outside of here with someone I trust, just in case." Another pause. "And the law firm that's going to represent Mr. Arthur is already aware that I exist and what I know." Gregory stared at that 26-year-old young man with the expression of someone recalculating a sum they'd gotten wrong. The anger in his face was mixed with something else, genuine concern. "You can fire me," Caleb said, "but it won't change anything that's already been done." He left the room with the same step he'd entered with, without running, without looking sideways, with the same strange calm that Mr. Arthur had shown at the fence that Tuesday morning that had started everything. The formal notice arrived at the Prairie Grain Processing Corp. On a Wednesday. The envelope had the letterhead of the law firm hired by the Regional Farmers Cooperative. Inside, a petition based on the technical report from Grant Sullivan, on 10 years of documentary records from Arthur Jenkins, on the sworn statement from Caleb Miller, and on testimony collected from 6 other farmers in the region who had suffered smaller but documentable impacts. The petition listed 3 demands: the immediate halt of the boundary-related evictions, the initiation of a soil remediation process paid for by the company, and the determination of a compensation amount for damages caused over the 10 years with documented proof. Gregory read the notice in his office with the door closed, twice in a row. Then he called Lawrence Sterling. The call lasted almost an hour. Lawrence arrived at the Prairie Grain Processing Corp. the next day. It was the first time in over 2 years that the company's owner had set foot on those premises in person. He was a man a little over 60, with well-kept grey hair, who had built the company with inherited resources but expanded it with genuine business talent. He wasn't a stupid man. He was someone who had made deliberately wrong choices and had delegated the most serious of them to other people, which, in the current crisis, offered him no protection whatsoever. Lawrence read the notice, read the report, read Caleb's statement. He said nothing for a long time. "Who authorized the targeted eviction strategy?" he finally asked the manager, sitting in the chair across from him. Gregory opened his mouth. "You don't need to answer right now," Lawrence said before anything came out. "Just tell me one thing. Can this be proven in court?" Gregory remained silent. "Gregory." "Probably," the manager said. Lawrence closed his eyes for a second. Then he got up, walked to the window, and stared at the operations yard his company had built. He remained silent for a time that no one in the room dared interrupt. "I need to go to the neighbor's property," Lawrence said. Everyone looked at him. "Alone," he added. Lawrence Sterling arrived at Mr. Arthur's property on a Thursday afternoon, by car, and stopped in front of the gate. Mr. Arthur was on the porch when the car arrived. He recognized the man still inside the vehicle by his posture and his well-kept grey hair. He stayed where he was. Lawrence got out of the car, walked to the gate, and stood outside. "Mr. Arthur," he said, "may I come in?" Mr. Arthur slowly came down the porch steps. He reached the gate, sized up the man on the other side, and opened it without saying a word. The two walked in silence to the edge of the fence line. Lawrence stared at the ruined ground, at the grain still scattered from the last discharge, at the strip of grey soil that stretched from the fence into Mr. Arthur's property for nearly 4 yards. The smell of fermentation still hung in the air, mixed with the smell of damp earth from the previous day. They stood there for a time that neither of them measured, Lawrence looking at the damage, Mr. Arthur looking at Lawrence, There was, in that strip of destroyed land along the boundary, something that needed no technical report to be understood. It was visible. It was smellable. It was the simplest and most brutal proof of everything that had happened there for 10 years, a piece of land that had once been fertile and now produced nothing because someone had decided that the expansion plan for a warehouse was worth more than it. It was the factory owner who broke the silence. "I didn't know the extent of what was happening," he said. His voice was different from the one at the meeting 12 years ago. It no longer had the broad smile, no longer had the presentation tone. It was the voice of someone saying what they think, without the mediation of what would be convenient to say. Mr. Arthur looked at him. "But you knew they were dumping," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement. With that calm that had confused so many people over so many years. Lawrence remained silent. He didn't try to contradict it. "I knew," he said finally. Arthur nodded. "Then don't pretend the surprise is about the damage. The surprise is about the scale of it." Lawrence looked at him. There was something in the older man's face that was hard to bear. Not hostility, but a quiet clarity that left no room for any alternative version of the story. "What do you want?" Lawrence asked. "What I've always wanted," Arthur said. "For you to stop, to recover it. For the land to go back to what it was before you all got here." Lawrence looked at the ground for a moment. "And the manager? The plan to buy the property," he said, as if testing how far the honesty needed to go. "I know about the plan," Arthur said. "I have enough documentation to prove that what happened here wasn't negligence. It was a choice." Lawrence was silent for a long time, staring at that strip of dead land. Then he said, "The responsibility is mine. I let it happen." It was the first time anyone from that side of the fence had said that out loud. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the fence, at the dead land, at the shed in the back where the 12 notebooks waited on a shelf. "Then you know what this is about," he said. "I do," Lawrence said. "And what are you going to do?" Lawrence paused before answering. "What should have been done from the start," he said. Audrey arrived that afternoon unaware of what had happened. She found her father on the porch, quiet, with that specific expression she had learned to associate with moments that carried real weight. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting down beside him. "The owner of the Prairie Grain Processing Corp. was here." She stared at him. "Lawrence Sterling, in person." "In person? And what did he say?" Arthur paused. "Said he knows what he needs to do." Audrey kept her eyes fixed on her father's face for a while. Then she asked, "And do you believe him?" Arthur looked at the fence, at the ruined ground, at the land that had been destroyed week after week for 10 years. "I don't know if I believe what he says," he replied. "But I believe what the documentation requires." She was silent. Then she placed her hand on her father's arm and stayed like that, without needing to say anything more. The agreement was formalized 3 weeks later, at a long meeting that took place at the Riverside Legal Group in the nearby township, and lasted the entire day. Present were the lawyer for the Regional Farmers Cooperative, Mrs. Martha, Arthur with Audrey beside him, Lawrence Sterling with his assistant, and by Mrs. Martha's decision, Caleb Miller, who had been invited as a witness and as an interested party in what had been built. Gregory Blackwood was not present. He had been removed from his position the previous week, with no return date set. The agreement established 4 main points. First, immediate and permanent suspension of any type of waste disposal on the north boundary of the Jenkins farm and in the vicinity of other affected properties in the region. Second, initiation within 30 days of a process to recover the degraded soil, paid for entirely by the Prairie Grain Processing Corp., with technical oversight by Grant Sullivan and supervision by the Regional Farmers Cooperative. Third, payment of compensation for the proven damages over the 10 years of documentation, calculated based on the technical report and the data from Arthur's notebooks. Fourth, reinstatement of Caleb Miller to his original position, with a written guarantee that there would be no penalty related to the episode. Arthur signed the agreement with the same pen he had used in the notebooks, an old black pen with a cracked cap that had survived 10 years of records on the shed shelf. When he signed, He held the paper for a second longer before letting it go, as if confirming to himself that the weight of it was real. Mrs. Martha, on the other side of the table, watched everything with that evaluating expression of someone carefully filing away the moment. There was something in her eyes that was different from the usual expression of someone running meetings. It was the specific satisfaction of someone who tried once and didn't succeed, watched someone else succeed, and understands that part of that success is also the result of everything that came before. Caleb sat in a chair at the back of the room with an expression that Audrey, when she looked at him, recognized as relief mixed with something that might have been shame for having taken so long to act. She made a point of walking past him before leaving the room. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb looked up. "It's the least I could do," he replied. "No," she said. "It wasn't the least. You had everything to lose and you did it anyway." He looked at her for a second. Then he nodded. The machines arrived on the morning of a Monday, 32 days after the agreement was signed. It was a team of 5 people with soil recovery equipment, led by a technician recommended by Grant Sullivan. Mr. Arthur was at the fence when they arrived, his fists resting on the top rail, just as he had been on so many other Tuesday mornings over 10 years. But it was different. The posture was the same. What lay behind that posture was completely different. One of the younger technicians, as he got out of the vehicle, looked at the man at the fence and asked, "Are you the owner of the property?" "I am," said Mr. Arthur. The young man looked at the ruined ground, at the grain still caked in the hardened mud, at the strip of grey earth stretching along the boundary. "I'm sorry for what happened here," he said simply. Mr. Arthur looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. "You can get to work," he said. The work lasted weeks. There were days of machines and churned earth, of sample analysis and layers being removed and replaced with healthy material brought in from elsewhere. The smell that had marked that strip of land for 10 years was slowly replaced by another smell. The smell of new soil, that specific scent of earth prepared to receive life, which Mr. Arthur had known since childhood and had missed without realizing he had missed it. Audrey came every week during the process. Sometimes she stayed for hours, sometimes she arrived near the end of the day. But she came. On one of those Saturdays, she found her father standing outside the shed, looking at the shelf inside through the open door. The 12 notebooks, the 12 labeled boxes, the blue folder. "What are you going to do with them?" she asked. "Keep them," he said. "Why?" "Because they're what's left," he replied. "And because someday someone might need to know that it worked." Audrey looked at the shelf for a moment. At those 10 years of patience and method, stacked in ordinary notebooks, stored on a wooden shelf in a rural shed. There was something about it that she couldn't quite name, but it filled her chest in a way that wasn't just pride. "Dad," she said. He looked at her. "You were alone in this fight for a long time. Why did you never ask me for help?" Mr. Arthur was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Because you already carry enough weight, and because it was my battle, not yours." "It was our battle," she said, with a firmness that surprised even herself. He looked at his daughter, at her eyes, which had the same stubborn gleam he had seen in the mirror for so many years. And he smiled. A small smile, the kind that, in people of few words, says more than a speech. "You're right," he said. "It was." On a Saturday morning, a little over 3 months after the start of the recovery process, Thomas West showed up at the gate on the boundary between the 2 properties at 6 in the morning, as usual, with a thermos of coffee in his hand and bread wrapped in a dish towel. Mr. Arthur was already awake. They went to the canvas chairs, sat down and drank their coffee in silence for a while, just as they always did. After a long moment, Thomas said, "I went by your boundary with the Grain Processing Corp. yesterday." "And?" said Arthur. "There's a chute." Arthur stopped with his cup halfway to his mouth. "There isn't." "There is. A small chute. But it's there. In the part they finished restoring first." Arthur set down his cup. He was quiet. "Go back there later," said Thomas. "I know what I saw." The two were silent for another while. The morning was slowly brightening over the trees, stripped bare by winter, over the tin roof of the shed, over the wooden fence that had withstood 10 years of rotten corn and the wear of time and was still standing. "Did you know it would come back?" asked Thomas, looking at the horizon of his friend's property. Arthur paused a moment before answering. "I knew it could," he said, "but knowing it could isn't the same as being sure." Thomas nodded. He understood. When Audrey arrived that Saturday, her father was waiting at the gate, which wasn't usual. She got out of the car with a shopping bag in her hand and looked at him with an expression of someone trying to read something. "What happened?" she said. "Come here." He led her along the edge of the property to the boundary point where the restoration work had started first. He stopped, pointed at the ground. Audrey looked. There, among the still dark restored soil, was a thin green shoot that had pushed upward without asking anyone's leave. Small, alone, with the silent determination of things that need to grow. She stared at that shoot for a long moment. Then she brought her hand to her mouth, not to hold back tears, though tears wanted to come, but because sometimes gestures are the only way to hold something too big for words. "Dad," she said, her voice a little different. "I know," he said. They stood there together, looking at that green shoot in the soil that had been dead for 10 years, and was, with the slowness the earth has when it decides to return, beginning to decide to return. The smell of fermentation was gone for good. What now reached that strip of land was the scent of turned, damp soil, that smell that anyone who knows the countryside recognizes. It means a new beginning. Arthur looked at the shoot for a while. Then he said something Audrey would keep for the rest of her life, in the exact words, in the tone, in that specific morning when it was spoken. "I didn't fight for the land," he said. "I fought so no one else would have to fight the way I did." Audrey looked at her father, at his sun-weathered face, at his still broad shoulders, at his white hair that the morning breeze moved slightly to the side, at that man who had stood alone for 10 years with a notebook in his hand, and the conviction that the truth kept patiently arrives. And she understood at that moment that there were things her father had taught her without ever saying aloud. That dignity is not asked for, that injustice is documented, that everything has its time, and rushing the conclusion is wasting the journey. She said nothing. She stood beside her father, lightly resting her shoulder against his, and stayed like that. On the other side of the fence, the property of the Grain Processing Corp. was silent. The unloading machines no longer came. The yard operated differently now, with new protocols and new supervision, under the terms of the agreement that had been signed with an old black pen with a cracked cap. And in the soil that had been dead and was returning, the green shoot remained there, unhurried, with the simple determination of things that need to grow. End of story. Did this story touch your heart? Tell us what you felt and where you're following us from. Leave a like, write in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.